Hello and welcome to Occult Book Review. This week's book is The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by Walter Evans-Wentz. Evans-Wentz is probably better known for his translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but this particular book is it's becoming more and more known, not least because of a later version of it which had an introduction by Terence McKenna, and we'll come back to that and why McKenna felt the need to write the introduction and why he felt this book was so important. When you read the title of this book, you can be forgiven for thinking it may be a collection of fairy tales, somewhat like Lady Gregory's collection or W.B. Yeats' collections. But the book is a lot more than that. There is a huge section in the centre of the book dealing with folklore from Celtic countries, Ireland, Brittany, Wales, Scotland, the Isle of Man, and some places around the world where Wentz saw comparable traditions and deities, not least, and strangely enough, Siam, where he draws parallels between the two of Dedanan and the archetypes in star lore and Siam mythology. Because the book is Wentz's degree thesis, which he published later, he gives descriptions of how the book will unfold at the beginning. He gives his methodology. He talks about the kind of people he draws his sources from, and he also begins with possible explanations for what fairies and these land spirits are. And so the first explanation he considers is what's called the naturalistic explanation, and that is how a landscape might influence people to shape the kinds of spirits that they believe they're dealing with. So in this case, Wentz talks about in Ireland, the way the fairies are considered to be known as the good people in some places, Connemara especially. And he talks about the landscape there and why that might shape how fairies look to the population. But then he talks about how fairies are seen in places like Scotland or in Northern Europe, where it's, say for example, he talks about fairies seen at cliff edges and near oceans, and so in this context the fairies become much rougher. They're more troll-like, you know, they kind of reflect the kind of unpredictable nature of the landscape. So that's Wentz's first concept, if you like, and where he comes from. The second explanation he talks about is one which I don't think is very popular anymore, but at the time obviously it was considered seriously enough for Wentz to include it in the book, and that is a memory of a Pygmy race. And he talks about how this race could, he kind of gives folklore examples from around the world, from Inuit people to indigenous Aboriginal people, and obviously the Celtic countries themselves. And he talks about how mounds, for example, with their small doorways, have been seen by some anthropologists as being a reason for why people might consider the fairies a folk memory of this small race. But by the end of the book he kind of dispenses with that particular idea. Another explanation for fairies that Wentz talks about is the folk memory of Druids. Now, what I would say about this is Wentz's book is over 100 years old at this point, and his concept of the Druids and indeed of the megalithic landscape itself is outdated. There's been so much scholarship since Wentz wrote the book that he would probably revise the book himself at this point, because he talks about Druids and he says Druids can't be the explanation for fairies simply because there were no female Druids of high standing. Now we know now that that's not the case. So in that context, Wentz he's outdated, but you know, you have to have a kind of a consideration for the type of academic environment he was coming from, and that kind of antiquarian mindset where men were in high positions everywhere, from being the archaeologists to being the folklorists, with some exceptions obviously, but so he has a kind of sexist view of what Druids were. Some of the fairy accounts that Wentz gives will be familiar to people. There's the kind of changeling example where people would think that a child was swapped with a fairy if the child had a particular illness. So that's kind of on the more sinister end. But then there's lots of other stories where fairies are seen to be, basically seen to be the dead. And he gives an example of a husband whose wife dies, and she comes back to him and she says, if you turn up at a certain place in the valley, you will see me, and you have a few seconds to be able to rescue me. Now, this reflects the story of Robert Kirk, if people are familiar with that. Robert Kirk was a Scottish reverend who wrote a book called The Secret Commonwealth. It was more of a long essay, really. And he infamously, he used to walk on fairy mounds, and it was said that he was captured by the fairies, and he turned up in, there's different versions of this story, but in one version he turns up in his nephew's dream, and he says, you'll have one chance to rescue me from fairyland. I'm going to appear at the baptism of my son, and when I appear in the church you have to throw something at me and that will break the spell. And the story goes that he did indeed turn up at this particular church, but his nephew was so astounded at seeing Kirk, seeing the spirit of Kirk, that he forgot to throw the object at him, and so Kirk was doomed to spend his life in fairyland. So I mentioned Terence McKenna at the start of this review, and another person that has to be mentioned really is Jack Falee, particularly his book Revelations, and I suppose you could say his book Messengers of Deception as well, because in a lot of cases the fairy folk aren't particularly nice to people. Certainly the gentry of Ben Bulben seem to have a contempt, or at least a knowledge of themselves being better than the human beings in the locality. This crops up quite a bit, actually. It crops up with the indigenous aboriginals, with their stories of the Mimi as well. And the parallels are quite striking when you look at the alien abduction phenomenon and the missing time phenomenon. There really is no difference in the experience, it's just the cultural sophistication that changes. And a good fictional book about that actually is Ian MacDonald's King of Morning, Queen of Day. I would recommend that highly. So for Vallee and for McKenna, there is no difference between fairy encounters and alien encounters. It's the same thing really, it's just how it's interpreted by the population. So that's one angle that's particularly interesting for a contemporary reader. Perhaps the most obvious explanation for fairies in the book is that they are the dead themselves. This kind of manifests in a couple of different ways. I'll just give an example of a particular story. There's a story where a man is rowing a boat out into the middle of this lake with two companions. And in the middle of this lake, it was said that there was a magical island. And when they got out into the middle of the lake, the two companions jumped overboard and presumably drowned. And months later, when the guy who was rowing the boat is walking through town, he sees these two men again, and he goes over to them and he says, look, I know that you've gone to fairyland, I know that you know the way there, can you help me? And one of the men says to him, are you seeing me with both eyes? And this makes the guy kind of step back a bit, and he closes one eye at a time, and he realizes that he can only see them with one particular eye. And so the fairies then trick him, and in some accounts of the story they pluck out his eye, and in another they spit in his eye. And this happens again and again, particularly in the stories of midwifery, and this again ties back to Jacques Vallée and Terence McKenna's ideas, because in an awful lot of cases women were said to be taken from villages, brought to a fairy mound, and they would help to give birth. For some reason the fairies aren't able to do practical things very well in a lot of the stories, so they bring women to help them deliver babies. Sometimes it's half human, half fairy babies, and then the women are brought back to their villages. But when they're brought back, sometimes they end up seeing the women that they met in fairyland, and this eye motif turns up again, where the fairy women will then blind the human woman from fairy sight, from seeing fairies anymore. There's parallels there, I suppose, with Odin, and also with the story of an Irish saint, Saint Bridget, and her parallel Carlow version, Saint Lazarian. Both of these female saints were said to have plucked out their eye in order to show God that they were dedicated to him. But coming back to the idea of the dead and the experience of people who encounter fairies, brings us to parallels between fairyland and Pim van Lovel's account of near-death experiences. If you read Evans-Wentz's book and then you read this book, you'll see that like Vallée's case, there is no real difference in the experience. It's just the context and the physical environments, which are, I suppose you could say, just perceptions of the culture and its sophistication at the time. Now, unfortunately, Evans-Wentz is not alive anymore, so he can't speak for himself on this, but McKenna felt strongly enough about it to actually write the introduction to a later version of the book. So it's quite obvious that those parallels are there. Going further into this, Evans-Wentz gives examples of the Egyptian concept of the soul as it was known to him back in 1911, of course, and he talks about the Ka and the Ba and how they're portrayed as being smaller replicas of the human being, but often with wings. So there's a tie-in to what Evans-Wentz saw as being fairies there. He quotes George Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough. Fraser said that in a lot of indigenous cultures, the soul is seen as being a smaller or dwarfish version of the human being themselves. But if anyone has read Professor Ronald Hutton's work, and I suppose you don't really have to have just read his work, but he talks about how the concept of fairies changed dramatically with Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, and then later Victorian drawings of fairies. And this is accurately reflected when you look at the Irish concept of fairies being the gentry, who are very tall and noble people, as I've already mentioned, quite aloof and often seen as being warlike as opposed to fluttering around a flower, as the later concept of fairies try to illustrate. So by the time we get to the end of this section of the book that deals with stories about fairies, Evans-Wentz is putting forward a new theory. Bear in mind, as we've already said, he wrote the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and later he would go on to be a theosophist for all of his life, I think. So he begins to talk about the idea of a soul monad, and he talks about how evolution accommodates levels of sophistication that keep rising based upon the physical characteristics of the life form. Now it gets quite deep, and you can see why I wanted to talk about this book not being like W.B. Yeats or Lady Gregory fairy book. It's not at all. It's a I suppose you'd call it, it's a philosophy book, really. So he talks about the idea of reincarnation, metempsychosis. This he talks about it at the start of the book, but he doesn't really go into the reason why until the end. And he talks about this idea of the evolution of the soul and how we will all return to this soul monad. And he talks about the levels of soul sophistication as being one explanation for fairies. and how even the smallest life form will have some form of soul within it. For Wentz then, the idea of reincarnation is tied very much into fairies, and we can see that again with the stories of the dead being able to come back, and paradise. And you could argue that Wentz is influenced also by his knowledge of the Bardo system within Buddhism. He talks about that quite a lot at the end of the book. At the end of the book then, the notion of good fairies and bad fairies is dispensed with. Wentz says that even good and evil are just habits that we will eventually discard. And he says that we will go back to this original soul monad, and he says that even our souls will eventually fade away. So he talks about this kind of returning to nirvana, but without any sense of self or ego. So I'm sure that most people who read the book won't expect to have those kinds of discussions going through their mind. I'm sure for a lot of people you can just take the book and read the center section, the folk stories, and if you want to do that, that's fine. But I think in terms of occult philosophy, it's well worth sticking with Wentz all the way through. One thing I would add, his writing style is it's difficult to say the least. Sentences go on for entire paragraphs, and you find yourself having to reread them over and over again just to kind of untangle the different points that he's making. His knowledge is vast, and so it's a book that you can really take your time over, and you will learn a lot from. So that's this week's Occult Book of the Week. It's The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. There are different versions of it available. You can pick it up on Kindle, I'm sure, quite cheaply, but as I said, because of Wentz's writing style, I would recommend having the book in print so that you can take your time and kind of really focus on what he's trying to say and understand what he's trying to say. Thanks a million, and I'll see you next week.